Can everybody hear me? Good. I apologize if I have to wake some of you up. If I disturb your nap, please just go back to sleep. Tough act to follow. General Abudi is a very tough act to follow. Before I launch my talk, I just want to say a couple of short things. One is when my father, he told me once was grieving over the loss of one of his comrades from World War II. He said that you never really die until you're forgotten. And we know that Norman Lane lost his life. He was KIA in 1968 in Vietnam. But as long as we remember him, he's still alive. I think he's with us here today. And he will always be remembered and always be alive as long as we remember him and the others that died with him. I belong to an organization called the Vietnam Veterans for Factual History. And it's made up of journalists, historians, academics, authors, pretty distinguished group of people, most of which are Vietnam veterans. We have one mission, and that's to make sure that the Vietnam War is portrayed accurately. We perform a function of checking on people who say they're Vietnam veterans and they aren't. We check on academics who make statements or write things that are factually incorrect. And we've pretty much made a name for ourselves. We're so badly liked by leftists in the United States that when we try to go to their conferences and symposiums or get on their panels, they won't even listen to us. In fact, if I wasn't here today, I'd be at the Lyndon Baines Johnson Library in Texas for the Vietnam Summit, supposedly the all and end all of lessons learned about the Vietnam War. It's just chock full of leftist academics and very few veterans of the war, especially combat veterans. We try to get one of our distinguished people like Bob Sorley or Dr. Mark Moyer or Dr. Robert Turner on one of their panels, and they wouldn't even entertain us placing one person on their 9 panels and over 30 presenters. This is the par for the course for us. Every time we show up, the leftists freeze us out. We're blacklisted. I say this because people in this audience, I think many of you are interested in factual history of Vietnam. And if you want to have a place to go to check your facts, I recommend you go to our website. All you have to do is search Vietnam Veterans for Factual History. You'll get our website. It's a great research tool for academics. And it's also a good place for people to check on who is who and who did what. And I'll leave it at that. By the way, Del Vecchio in the audience, who was mentioned earlier, he's also a member of this organization. He's out in the audience somewhere, and if you have any questions about what we do and how we do it, he'll be glad to tell you. We're all self-financed. We don't take money from anybody or any organization, so no one can accuse us of promoting one side against the other. We're totally nonpartisan. Okay, I'm going to talk briefly about the title here, Dear Mom and Pop. That's the salutation that I used in my letters home. Next slide, please. These are the topics I'm going to talk about. I've taken a few topics I think that might be of interest to the general audience, and I'll be talking about them. Next slide, please. Beginning in the summer of 1962 and lasting until the death of my mother in 2008, I sent weekly letters to my parents. And during the Vietnam War, I was not always able to send a letter each week due to operational constraints, but I tried to send at least 3 a month. When my mother died, our family went through a large filing cabinet in my deceased father's home office, and there we found some of my father's among my father's various legal folders, all the letters I had sent to my parents over those 40 years. The letters were arranged in chronological order in files devoted to each year. I had no idea my parents had saved my letters, but as I began reading them, I decided they could form the basis of a combat memoir of the war and serve as a fact check on my memory and to add color and context to the other primary sources I used as reference material. As a result, my letters included command chronologies, operations orders, photos, interviews, patrol reports, captured documents, etc. The only communication I had with my parents during the war was via free mail, the free mail service that was provided to all military personnel in country. I never once called home, didn't have access to a telephone. And of course, we had no cell phones, laptops, or any other electronic means of communication available to us at that time. As I began reading these Vietnam War letters, which I had penned 40 years previously, I realized that much of what I wrote then must have filled my parents with dread, since I was quite frank about what I was doing and how I felt about combat operations. It was not my intent to do this. I didn't want to alarm my parents, but I felt that these letter homes, in addition to informing my parents of my activities, would serve as a sort of journal or diary of the war. My letters home covered 32 months I spent in South Vietnam, from February 1967 to January 1968, and then from December 1968 until June 1970. Next slide, please. During my first and second tours of duty in South Vietnam, I spent 21 months with units assigned to Quang Nam Province in Northern I Corps, a province that had South Vietnam's second largest city in it, Da Nang. Quang Nam was one of the four most combat-intensive provinces of the war and had large segments of it under communist control for most of the war. I held 3 jobs during those 21 months. First slide, or next slide. I spent 11 months as a force recon team leader. I went on 32 long-range reconnaissance patrols in Quang Nam, Toi Tien, and Quang Tin provinces. Next slide. During my second tour, I started off as a force recon operations officer with the 1st Force Reconnaissance Company, headquartered in An Hoa, which is a combat base in the southern part of Quang Nam province. Next slide. I also was a company commander, a rifle company commander. I had Golf Company, 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines for about 6 months. Next slide, please. Late in my second tour in Vietnam, I volunteered to extend my tour of duty from 13 months to 19 months so I could be assigned to the CIA for duty as the advisor to their Provincial Reconnaissance Unit in Tay Ninh Province. This was a strategically important province since it was bordered on 2 sides by Cambodia, and 3 North Vietnamese Army divisions were located on its borders. Until 1967, it was also the home of the Central Office South Vietnam, normally referred to as COSVIN. COSVIN was the command and control organization responsible for the communist military and political activity in all of South Vietnam, and it reported directly to Hanoi. The province was also the home of the Cao Dai religion, a vital but at times tepid ally of the Saigon government. Next slide, please. Here are 2 pictures of me with my PRU. We were the principal action arm of the CIA, and our exclusive mission was to neutralize the political leadership of the Communist Party in the villages and hamlets of that province as part of the Phoenix program. Since this conference is devoted to how we communicated with our families at home, I will present a few short items from the nearly 200 letters I sent home during the war that I think may be of interest to the audience. Next slide. A great deal of ink has been spilt concerning the Tet Offensive of 1968 and whether or not the United States and the South Vietnamese knew about the offensive, and if they did, why they were unable to prevent it. Here's what I wrote to my parents in December 1967, nearly 2 months before the enemy made their countrywide attempt to win the war. At the time, I had just been made the executive officer of a newly formed reconnaissance company, having spent the previous 11 months as a platoon commander of a long-range reconnaissance platoon. In this letter home, I wrote, and I'll quote here, "Everyone here expects the enemy to launch a big attack around Tet. A staff sergeant, who I know at the Division G2 office, told me a month ago that the enemy was planning something big, but he did not think much of it. And he said so because he thought everything pointed to the fact that they were losing and they did not have the force levels needed to accomplish much. Our company commander, Captain James Cahill, told us yesterday that we have intelligence that the enemy will launch their attack using a rocket attack on the Da Nang Air Base, since they don't want to use any radio transmissions which might give away the timing of their attack. I don't know how he knows this, but I suspect it has something to do with the radio battalion or some other good source of intelligence. Captain Cahill said the enemy intended to lead their attacks using Viet Cong and NVA sappers and then exploit any success they have by using elements of the 2nd North Vietnamese Army Division. For our part, since we are only in a training posture, we are making sure that our perimeter is secure and our guard force is reinforced so the enemy doesn't catch us napping, end quote. Later on in another letter home, I wrote about a failed attempt to precipitate the offensive using a ruse called Operation Claxton, which involved using explosive charges at the Da Nang Air Base to fool the enemy into thinking that rockets were landing there. Here's what I wrote then, quote, "We were briefed today on a really ingenious plan to cause the enemy to launch their big attack prematurely. It involved placing recon teams and infantry units along the most likely avenues of approach to Da Nang and then exploding charges meant to mimic rocket attacks on the airbase. We understand the enemy will use a rocket attack to signal their units to begin their attacks. I hope the enemy takes the bait because we definitely are ready for them," end quote. On New Year's Eve of 1967, I saw this ruse executed. I personally observed the entire event since our camp was only a few miles from the airbase. I vividly remember standing in the darkness with Captain Cahill and other officers in our company for this false attack to take place. When we saw the airbase light up as if under attack and heard the explosives going off, we felt the entire thing looked exactly like it was intended to look. But alas, the enemy did not take the bait, and it would be another month before they decided to launch their general offensive. What my letters home point out is this: even at the level of a recon company in training, we knew that a major attack was being planned by the enemy for some time around the tent holidays. What we did not know was the date and what targets the enemy intended to attack. Next slide, please. When the tent offensive was launched in South Vietnam, I was in Okinawa, Japan, training my newly formed recon company for future employment in South Vietnam. We had just arrived on Okinawa and were just beginning our training when we heard that the enemy had launched their planned tent offensive. Each day, as part of my routine as the XO of our company, I coordinated with the G3 at the 9th Marine Amphibious Brigade headquarters and attended the daily intelligence briefings conducted by the G2. I was in a rather unique position at this time because I was privy to the classified reports on the Tet Offensive coming out of South Vietnam and also watching Armed Forces television, news reports coming from the United States, and also reading U.S. newspaper articles about the enemy offensive. What emerged was a strange dichotomy between what was being reported from South Vietnam via military channels and what was being reported by journalists, both stateside and in South Vietnam. After the initial chaos and shock of the scope of the enemy attacks, the military intelligence reports began to show the enemy was taking heavy losses, and aside from continued resistance in Hue City and Saigon, they were in full retreat. However, this was not evident in any of the reporting I saw on television or read about in U.S. newspapers. They painted a picture of abject failure on the part of the American military and our South Vietnamese allies. What appeared to be a huge military failure on the part of the North Vietnamese was being portrayed in the U.S. media as a huge communist victory. Of course, this inability of the U.S. and Western press to accurately report the events in South Vietnam during Tet in 1968 had a disastrous impact on the U.S. public and convinced President Johnson to declare he would not run for re-election. My letters home at this time reflected this dual impression that and I went out of my way to inform my parents that what they were seeing on television and reading back in the States did not conform what I was reading in intelligence reports coming from South Vietnam. When I reflect on this obvious dichotomy, I can only surmise that the Western press in South Vietnam panicked when they witnessed the attacks in Saigon, where just about all of them were stationed, lived, and worked. Had they been out in the countryside reporting instead of in Saigon, I think they would have realized that the countrywide attacks were short-lived and failed to achieve any of the stated objectives of the communists. One lesson that can be drawn from this is the need to embed journalists with operational units and not keep the press enclosed in a cocoon of security far removed from where the real war is being fought. Next slide. During my first tour of duty in South Vietnam, I saw little evidence of American anti-war movement activities or of VC propaganda. Although at the end of my first tour, when I was in Okinawa, I became aware of the work of the American Lawyers Guild, a communist front organization that published an anti-Vietnam War and anti-military publication on the island, and they were active in trying to recruit U.S. service personnel to desert or stage demonstrations against the military. However, on my second tour in South Vietnam, I saw an increase in VC propaganda aimed at American soldiers and Marines. This propaganda was very sophisticated and often included the skillful use of comments made by prominent politicians and celebrities in the U.S. I also saw several incidents of racial agitation and a breakdown in military discipline as a result. In several letters home, I wrote about these things, and although I did not think much of it at the time, I can tell from reading these letters now, many years after the events transpired, they caused me to write some pretty powerful words about them to my parents. For example, here's an excerpt from a letter I wrote home during the time I was a rifle company commander in Quang Nam. Quote, 2 days ago, one of my platoons returned from a patrol south of Liberty Bridge, and they brought with them some pretty sophisticated enemy propaganda leaflets. It appeared that these leaflets had been produced on modern printing equipment, and the English on them was correct in every respect. While most propaganda like this is laughed off by Marines, these leaflets definitely got their attention because they contain quotes attributed to some of our so-called political leaders in the U.S. There were quotes from Senator Fulbright and the late Senator Robert Kennedy, along with statements made by Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. and the communist Angela Davis. I had to explain to my man that these quotes were probably taken out of context and did not actually mean what they appeared to mean. Some of the men were extremely angry and said some things about these people that I would not dare mention in a letter home. End quote. Next slide. In May of 1970, when I was nearing the end of my second tour, I had the opportunity to interview a senior North Vietnamese Army political officer who had been recently captured in Cambodia and was being held in Tay Ninh by the U.S. military before he was to be transported to Saigon for further interrogation by the CIA. At the time, I was the Tay Ninh Provincial Reconnaissance Unit advisor. When I was assigned to the CIA, my letters home were very banal and opaque due to the classification of my work. Evidently, my letters achieved their purpose because my parents told me later they thought that I was posted in Laos or Cambodia, and my job was with the State Department. For this reason, those letters that were sent home in the embassy pouch were very, very banal and opaque. As a Prue advisor, I had access to a great deal of political intelligence that normally would not be, normally a military officer would not be able to see. Some of which should have been denied to me due to the highly classified nature of the topics. However, on one occasion, I became privy to the most closely guarded secret of the war, the existence of a highly placed CIA spy inside the enemy's political infrastructure, a spy, I will point out, that reported to the CIA for 10 solid years on highly classified enemy strategic intelligence. It came to my attention when a CIA case officer who lived in the same villa with me became despondent and drunk one night and allowed me to see a top secret field report that he had prepared that contained information provided by this spy. The spy was known in the intelligence community as the Tay Ninh source. His real name was Vo Van Bach. I write about the spy at some length in my book, Rice Paddy Recon, and I would point out that everything about the spy is still classified. You will not be able to see anything on the internet or anything else about him, but if you get a hold of translations of North Vietnamese articles, you can read about him because they recognized he was an incredible, dangerous spy for 10 years. In conclusion, I'd like to briefly talk about this interview I had with the captured NVA political officer. I mentioned earlier that he was a very senior officer assigned to the enemy's headquarters in South Vietnam, known as the Central Office of South Vietnam, or COSVIN. My CIA boss allowed me to interview this political officer because he thought such a prisoner could provide some information about the VC finance economy cadres who supported NVA units with logistical support whenever they entered the province. And I was interested in targeting these finance economy cadres. It was a high priority for me. I interviewed him for nearly 3 hours, and in the course of this interview, I was amazed by the confidence this individual had about the outcome of the war. To be honest, his arrogance and his complete confidence in the ultimate victory of the North Vietnamese made me angry. Since he was providing me with some valuable intelligence, I tried not to show my emotion when I questioned him. But I finally put the question to him as to why he was so confident his side would win, even though he had recently been captured in Cambodia and the communists did not control a single district or province in all of South Vietnam. His answer spurred me to a lifelong study of the war and its origins and conduct. Here's what he said, and I'll point out here that this is not a direct quote. I could not write about what he told me and send it home. And my notes from that interview were turned over to a warrant officer, and it was also included in a classified field report, which the CIA has not declassified. So what I'm going to try to do here is I've sort of recreated what he told me. Quote, this is what he said. I am confident of final victory because this war was decided long ago, before the Americans ever became to Vietnam. The Americans gave us 2 gifts, and he stressed the word gifts, that made our victory inevitable. These gifts were given to us in 1962 and 1963. The first gift was the Geneva Accords on the neutrality of Laos and Cambodia in 1962, and the second gift was the murder of President Diem in 1963. These two things sealed the fate of the puppets in Saigon and made it impossible for your side to win. You should have realized this in 1963, but your arrogance led you down the path of defeat, end quote. At the time, I did not comprehend the meaning of his words, but after many years of study, I have concluded that he was right. If we have time during the Q&A later on, I'll be glad to address this topic. That concludes my remarks, and thank you for staying awake.